Welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Higher Line podcast. We are again remoting. We are recording remotely. I've been on the road for 34 days and it sounds like I need some sleep or some rest because I can't say the right words. I've got a friend of a friend on here today, Doc Huhn's, which you go by online, but your name is Seth. What's your real last name?
Yep, Haselhuhn. So it's Doc Huhn. I've got one of those names that does not pronounce anything like it's spelled. So
sounds like
I've been around fighting that my whole life.
Restaurant Haselhuhn.
Haselhuhn. Yeah, I think it literally translates in German into yellow chicken. And so our mutual acquaintance Z really gets a kick out of that from time to time, as you can imagine.
Haselhuhn, yellow chicken. Yeah, I like it. So you specialize in performance. Is that kind of your thing? Like improving performance, human performance?
Yeah, specifically in the cognitive / mental performance realm. But yeah, I've been working in human performance and special operations for just over 10 years now.
So, like me just saying the wrong word, fix me. Do it now. I'm just kidding.
Saying the wrong word. Do it right now. Okay, so what are you going to take to collect your thoughts before you say them out loud? Probably a lack of sleep you're going to have to overcome that. So you're going to have to be a little bit more focused on being intentional and deliberate.
Let's go back a little bit. I like that. Intentionality and deliberate presentation would make sense. Don't just wing it. So you come from a background of sports, right? You played some sports. And how does a guy go from that to teaching super soldiers how to be better?
Well, the short story is on accident, really. I came out of Eastern Montana and wanted to be a baseball player, and there's no baseball in Eastern Montana at the time. There's at least no high school baseball. So I got through the junior college ranks and then got an opportunity to play at a really high NAIA level at Lewis Clark State College in Idaho. Made a couple really bad decisions about a couple of knee surgeries. You know, you can't tell an 18-year-old, 19-year-old anything about the future, right? So I fell complete victim to that classic mistake. Then my wife and I, she was coaching women's basketball at the University of Idaho. I wanted to coach college baseball, so I knew I needed a master's degree. We knocked out a master's degree as fast as possible. Again, a little bit, what's the right word for it? Impulsive, just trying to get things done as fast as possible. I coached some college baseball for 6 or 7 years. 2009 timeline, budgets crash, all the job. My wife says, "Hey, look, dude, I know you want to coach college baseball, but I don't want to move across the country every year while you climb the totem pole. Why don't we look at something else?" And so all the jobs I wanted to do said PhD required. So I begrudgingly went back to doctor's school. And in the middle of completing the requirements for that, some of which were to do, presentations at international conferences in the academic world, I was asked to interview for a big Army job. That didn't work out. But the next year, the special operations guys were hiring, and the people that didn't like me for the big Army job said, "Hey, you'd fit in with those assholes real well. So why don't you go give them a shot?" And a month later, I'm deciding to go drop the sport and the college professor world and jump headfirst into a special operations community of which I knew very little about. So that was 10 years ago. I kind of got flung into it in the middle of it. I mean, if you can imagine dropping a civilian into the middle of a special forces group and with no prior knowledge, no prior service, really not understanding what they do, only some preconceived notions, and then not being very welcomed with not a very strong plan of what are you going to do every day. I was kind of on my own to figure it out, which turns out to be a blessing in the long run. it definitely made the first couple years difficult, to say the least. And here we are. So there was no intention behind it. I never set out to go do this job specifically. This is just one of those kind of circumstantial, right place, right time, things work out stories.
What'd you get the master's and PhD in?
Well, we knocked the master's degree out in, I think it's officially recreation, which is a little bit more of a philosophical bend on sport management. So it's kind of like I like this. This will offend some sport management people, but it's kind of like the recreation sport management degree is kind of a watered down business degree. Um, we knocked that out because it was the fastest one to get out of there. And again, in our youth, we were impulsive and trying to get life over with really fast and just trying to be ambitious and get things done. And so we knocked that out real fast. Then real life kicked in, a couple kids and a mortgage and all that stuff later, and losing a job. So again, we were kind of in a hurry to get to the next thing. And the PhD is in sport pedagogy and character education, which is pedagogy is a fancy word for kind of the art and science of teaching things. And my coursework was basically divided into three different prongs, if you will. The first one being sports psych, the second one being sports sociology, and the third one being sport ethics. And that's where the character education part comes in. It's actually served me pretty well working in the soft community, because I end up using the sociology and the ethics side of it a lot more advantageously than just the straight up sports psych part of it.
Interesting. So you show up there at this training facility, and these guys are like, "Who the hell's this dude?" So
right, they're like, "Hey, college boy, what are you going to tell us about being in a gunfight?"
Yeah. What does that look like? I know a lot of these guys. I know you because of one of these guys. I I guess they're still human beings, but by and large, that type of individual is often, in my experience, the kind of person where if you can't match them and in experience or vest them in experience, they got nothing. You got nothing for them. I can let me just real quick
tell
that's 100%
accurate.
Let me tell a story one time for the listeners, not so much you, but it'll paint the picture clearly. I was asked to help out with some curriculum development for a concealed carry course that was nationwide. And all of the guys hired by the organization were all former retired special operations dudes, high-level SEALs. One of the guys was one of Charlie Bethwick's first dudes at Delta. So like super, like high level dudes. And I was the only one that just walked in off the street. And these guys are, rattling around a table, all their ideas. And I'm like the naysayer every time. Like, wait, you guys want like moms to have to make 50-yard headshots and like barrel roll. And they turned it into like a selection process to go through this like week-long, like armed citizen thing. So we go out to the range, and none of them will like me because I'm like poo-pooing all their ideas. And then we go out to the range, and I outshot them all. So then I was their friend because I could do something, like that validated or at least like put me on a notch of the ladder that like, okay, we can listen to you now. You're not a complete moron. You can shoot better than all of us. And there were some great dudes. Some of us had become lifelong friends after that. But I was thinking about that story, thinking of you. And this was just like a couple weeks of work. It wasn't like a career or a full-time job. So that had to be daunting.
Well, it's funny that you use that story, because that's almost exactly what happened to me. They sent me out to one of their internal schools that has to do with direct action stuff, and they didn't want me there. The instructors weren't happy that I was there, and they explicitly told me that I was not allowed to speak to any of the students, and if I had any questions, I could only talk to them and just stay out of the way and kind of go stand in the corner. And so I asked them a lot of questions, and I was actually kind of failing in my job because I'm the one that's supposed to be there to help them recognize social situations and situational awareness and all this other stuff. And I'm asking them clearly, apparently too many why questions. Like, why do you do it this way? Why do you do this drill and then do this drill? Why does the progression work like this and not like this? And at one point, one of the saltier ones unholstered his hot Glock and kind of shoved it in my chest and said, "Here, you do it." And so I took a shot at the target he told me to shoot, and thank goodness it hit the target. And he said, and I went to like hand it back to him, and he said, "No, all of them." And so I put the next 14 rounds in that 3-inch dot, and then, locked and cleared it just like they'd briefed their students in the safety brief, and handed it back to him. And he slammed another magazine in there, pushed it in my chest again, and said, "Bullshit, do it again." And so thank heavens that those 15 rounds went into the next 3-inch dot, locked and cleared it again, handed it back to him, and he said, "Fine, you can stay." And then he walked away and didn't talk to me for the rest of the day. Like, he was almost upset that I could shoot the gun. But
didn't know you were a country boy from Montana.
That's right. Once I demonstrated that I could handle a firearm, then that was the first kind of icebreaker into, okay, you're not here to report on us. You're not here to write a book about us. You're not here to do all of those things that they were worried about, because this based on your experience. They run in pretty tight circles, and they defend that circle pretty strongly, and they have experiences that only they can get, right? Like, you and I can't have the experience that they have professionally in combat without going to combat, right? And so what am I, as a civilian with a PhD? And again, that's what they used to say, is like, "What are you going to tell us about being in a gunfight, college boy? What do you know about anything? You don't know shit about anything in college. They don't teach you any of this stuff in college. How can you help us with this?" And
were those real conversations, Seth, or is that your interpretation of what they were saying? Did guys really say that shit?
No, that's a verbatim quote that I've heard a lot in the first year that I was here. That was, what are you going to tell us, college boy? What do you got for us, college boy? And once I demonstrated that, one, I could handle a firearm, and two, that I was willing to go be out with them doing their things, following them around in the dark with no night vision on, and just participating with, within reason. I'm not pretending to be one of them, and I'm not claiming to be one of them, but they're out doing some overnight mission and training where they're gonna, walk 13 clicks through the woods to go find a target. Like, I'm just walking along with them, except I'm the only asshole out there without nods because they wouldn't give me any. And it was just a step into kind of like, it's very show me culture. If you can't show me that you're willing to hang, then I don't have any time to listen to what you have to say. And it was just a couple stepping stones. And then once they started asking me questions, I knew I had to be right. And so the easy, obvious answers, I needed to give them options because they're the experts and I'm clearly the outsider in their environment. And so I used the sports sociology literature that says this is the relatively universal process of being accepted as a member of a team, right? You have to learn about the activity. You have to learn about what the goals are. You have to learn the language. You have to learn about the people who do that activity. And then you have to interact with them and learn how they communicate with each other, how they interact with each other, and what they expect from each other. And if you can just keep making that cycle, eventually you become an accepted member of that group. And I got in there just one thing at a time, just giving them simple answers like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And it was kind of a sharp shooting question, because that's how these guys operate. And if you could give them, I would give them like the simplest stuff that I knew that if they did it, it would work or it would come out this way. So I would say things like, "Hey, well, if you do A, you'll get B. If you do C, you'll get D. And if you do E, you'll probably get F. Like, what do you want to do? You're the expert here. You tell me." Right. And they'd go try it on one guy or try it on two guys, and then they'd come back and sharpshoot it a little bit more. But that's just part of the process of how they communicate with each other in that culture, because at the end of the day, in that culture, competence always wins. It doesn't matter who you are or where you came from. If you're good at what you do, you're in. And if you're not good at what you do, you're out. Right. And so whether it's handling a firearm or being willing to kind of suck with them for a while, long movements in the dark, around helicopters and bombs and guns and all that stuff. Like, if you're just willing to hang, then you can get some respect as a person, and then all you have to do is show a little bit of value to help them get a little bit better, and they'll come back for a little bit more and come back for a little bit more. And then once you've established that relationship a little bit, now we've got this agreement, kind of like unspoken agreement, that I'm here to help you. I'm not here to report on you or do anything that's going to hurt your career. I'm here to help you reach your goals, and I have a very, very specific expertise in how to do that. But I need to learn a lot of stuff from you in order for me to do my job. And so that's why I'm asking you all these questions. I'm not trying to like sharpshoot you or judge you. I'm just trying to put this together so that I understand it, so that I can answer your questions better and give you some better feedback and guidance on how to do it in my specific lane. The rest of this is yours, man. Like, I'm just here to help you. I'm not in the Army. I'm not in the military. I'm like the second tier support guy, right? Like, I'm the third volunteer assistant coach right now. You guys are running the show. I'm here to support you where I can. In the meantime, like, you need some help hanging targets or picking up brass or doing whatever it is that you need to do. Like, I'm happy to do that too, because I don't like to stand around and be useless either. Right. And once we made it through a couple of those cycles, and then some of the stuff that I was giving them was working, and showing them how they could prove to other people that the way that they wanted to do it was the best way to do it, then we started to move forward. And again, we're just going through that process of like, all right, now internally with this group of instructors, I understand how they operate, but I didn't understand how that group of instructors could influence the other people in the unit, or the other people in the group, or the other people in the regiment, however you want to look at it. And then as you continue to complete that cycle, then I get better informed of how the interactions work, and I get better informed of how their goals work. And then I can give them better feedback. And now 10 years later, I've got a pretty good, solid understanding of what they do in training. I've got a pretty solid understanding of how their training translates into what they do operationally. And I can give them some pretty specific feedback about what they're doing just because of the way that they train me to do it.
Makes sense. What is an example of some of these things you're talking about? Like, it doesn't have to be like, hyper specific.
Right, so
how are you helping a super soldier be better? Like, how can I apply some of these things, these principles, these ideas? What are we talking about?
all right, so you teach.
Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example of something that I see constantly, and maybe this is be a better way for me to approach this. May I?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I train several thousand people in marksmanship stuff every year. I just finished a 5-day class, and something I see, it's flattering. I'll have the same guys come back several times a year. Maybe I'll have a guy that I've seen 10 times in 5 years. That's a lot of money, right? And I'll watch them, and you begin, because we're doing pretty much the same stuff. I'll see him like, man, make a name up, Bob. Bob's doing the same damn thing he was doing 2 years ago, 6 months ago, the last time I saw him. And I'll go, Bob, why are you not, applying some action to this thing? Or you're still freaking missing to the left, or your fucking optic fell off. Like, when I first met you 5 years ago, you forgot to put thread locker and check the torque specifications on your gear, and now you should know all this. Like, I'll see things like that, and I think to myself, what the hell am I doing wrong that this guy has got the same stupid crap going on, and we've addressed it, we've looked at it. Like, maybe comment on something like that.
All right, so that's exactly one of the things that I do. And so they obviously have a marksmanship training unit, and if we're talking about repeated mistakes, then somehow the cadre is failing to communicate their intentions in a way that the student can relate to it, right? Mm-hmm. And so the student either doesn't understand the importance of it or the consequences of it, or is looking at it as an isolated problem instead of in context of how this is going to affect them overseas. And so if it's a repeated problem, then it's an instructor problem. Right?
This is never my problem, though, Seth. None of these problems come back to me. I'm just kidding.
Well, that's one of the things. And really, when I started being critical, they started to respect me a little bit more because I was willing to tell them when they were wrong. So repeated problems is usually an instructor problem. It's rarely a student problem. It's an inability of the instructor to relate the material to the student, whether it's importance or contextual application. Another example is they record the progress or the performance of the students in the marksmanship course. And so I said, how do you know that this program of instruction is effective, right? And so if I come take your course, you're probably going to have me shoot something relatively cold on day 1, and you're probably going to have me shoot something very similar to that on day 5, so that you can demonstrate that I've improved, right?
Sure.
Pretty common model in marksmanship training. And so I started looking at the scores, and I could tell them, like, hey, look, when you guys do this program of instruction this way, these different drills that you're scoring that all replicate a different type of marksmanship or marksmanship in a different context, however you want to look at it, these are improving statistically significant differences, right? Which means that that didn't happen by chance. So there's something going on here that is providing this change. These two are not moving at all. Why are these two not moving at all? And so what that tells me is that, this drill, this one that you're scoring, tells me as the outsider that doesn't know anything about what you guys do, but if you're scoring this drill and it involves hitting multiple targets in a single string of fire, and it's the same score on average from the first day until the last day, nothing's changing, that tells me that there's something missing in the POI that is not teaching them the skill set that they need to have in order to perform that type of marksmanship. Does that make sense?
Sure.
And so we did it there's no psychology in that. That's just straight up like performance stuff. If you're going to set a performance goal, you have to teach the skill. They have to understand the skill. They have to demonstrate that they can execute the skill. And now we start getting into the performance goal side of it, of how well they can do the skill, which means we need to measure it somehow. And if you're choosing to measure some things over others, that tells me that the ones what's that?
I said application side of it.
Yep, application.
Yeah.
And so if you're choosing to score some of these things and choosing not to score the others, then in my small brain, that means that the ones you're scoring are the most important. All right, cool. So then we go back through and we just look at the data and we say, look, these drills stop becoming significantly different at this point. But you still shoot it 7 more times. Why don't we swap that time in the POI out for something that helps the students learn the skill that you're evaluating them on the drill that doesn't move? And that we did that. We built some training into it, and now all of a sudden all the drills are improving significantly, right?
Makes great sense.
And now it's like, okay, well, nobody ever asked us for the scores before. Now that you've shown us how we could use the scores to improve our POI, we're improving everyone's performance now, because we understand how to evaluate the POI. Another example is, like, they were running a drill that they didn't really understand the context for, and it was related to some other problems, but I just sprinkled a little bit of like motor control, motor learning research on it, and said, hey, like, this drill doesn't have anything to do with combat, but it has everything to do with learning a skill set. So if we put it in this way, we're going to have to package it so that the students will relate to it and understand it for what it's worth. But if we put this in there, that will solve your pistol marksmanship problems, and it might influence some of your rifle marksmanship problems, but I don't know. So I put the drill out. We sat down. I had a little bit of buy-in with some of the instructors at that point, and we put this drill together, and they ran it. They gave it its due diligence and ran it, and all the scores jumped significantly across the board. On day 1, we were getting scores as a group higher than day 5 scores. right? And so once I could make it less about the psychology and more about the physical learning, then I could just weave the psychology into it. And they don't need to know that they're doing sports psychology. They just need to know that, like, if you're here, you help us get better at the things we want to get better at. And that's the way that I relate my information that I can provide to them in a way that they can process it and use it. Because at the end of the day, I think that you would probably agree, most of these types of guys' prime value is utility. If I can't use this to make me better, then I'm not listening to you talk about it anymore.
Sure.
Right? It's like,
you're wasting my life.
Yeah, when you were naysaying all the guys in the concealed carry POI and like, hey, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work. As soon as you could demonstrate why, then one side of that is, oh, your input is making us better. That's good. And two, oh, we can use you now. Like, we can use your input now. It has utility. And that comes from the sport ethics side of the house, right? Like, we know that one of the non-moral values that we have is utility. You value your gun because it has a use to you, right? Just like you value your money because it has a use to you. And your value of that gun may be different than my value of the same gun because we have different uses for it, right? And again, it's just kind of like weaving all this together and just trying to find a way so that I can be value added to them, because at the end of the day, like, I'm not going to combat. And so if I'm going to be out there and I'm going to take time away from what they've already established as effective to train guys to go to combat, and it's not working, then I don't need to be out there.
So you said weaving in some sports psychology stuff. What does something like that look like? And it didn't sound like you were trying to hide it, but insert it in a way that it was easily consumable, maybe, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So a lot of it is a social problem. If I go to a bunch, let's put you in the situation. If you go into the concealed carry example that you're talking about, and what you identify that these guys need to be more intentional or mindful about their practice, and you say, hey guys, what you should do is this mindfulness exercise, you're going to get laughed out of that room, because mindfulness is what hippies do when they do yoga, right? And so I recognize that they need to be more mindful about what they're training on. And so the trick part of it was we just had to deliver the content to the students in a way that they're learning how to shoot their gun, but what they're really doing is a mindfulness exercise to focus on their trigger press. And that's how we weave it together. And so the sports psych part of it is, how do I be mindful, which is like a pretty pure version of focus. If we look at the construct of our attention, right? Like, the way that I describe attention to guys is, attention is your situational awareness, your ability to notice everything external and internal in your environment, right? Like, you can notice the external environment. We're all pretty good at that. But we also have an internal environment that we can pick up on and notice. And so if that's attention, it's kind of like the radar. It picks up everything. Focus is our ability to direct that attention to the things that are important and ignore the things that aren't, right? And so the things that are important,
some data, we don't know what's important until we know what's important or not important. Like, if you've never shot a gun, you don't know if the things you're doing are important or unimportant. So you got to have some body of evidence or somebody telling you what's important or not, right?
That's right. And so we can figure out, like, and this is where I was wrong a couple times, was that, hey, you're scoring this drill. That tells me that it's important, which means it's something that you're focusing your attention on, more so than the things that you're not scoring, because I don't know anything about anything at this point. And so when we put this drill together, one of the things that they were focusing on was marksmanship. They wanted bullets to go where they intended them to go, right? If I want this bullet to go in the chest box of a VTAC target, or in the head box of a VTAC target, or in the corner of the right eye of the VTAC target, then I need to be able to focus on that marksmanship. And what I saw from my sport background is the way they were practicing that could be improved if we could figure out a way to get them to focus on the skill that's creating the miss, as opposed to what my target looks like compared to what my buddy's target looks like. Right? Because if you and I are shooting on the flat range and your target has one hole in it where all the bullets went, and my target looks a little bit more like a shotgun, am I going to apply the fundamentals that you're trying to teach me to do, or am I just going to Kentucky windage this so my target looks better?
Process versus outcome.
Process versus outcome, right? So how do we get them to focus on the process? That's an exercise in mindfulness, right? Is I have to be able to master the skill set and let the target just reflect what happened in my hands, so that I can make adjustments with what's happening in my hands until the point where I have a repeatable process that produces predictable results. And if I can build a repeatable process, my results become predictable. Then when the results that I'm predicting don't occur, when I miss, then I know exactly what it is and I have an adjustment prepped for the next round automatically, right? Because I'm trying to master this skill. I'm not just trying to get a good score on the drill. I'm trying to master the skill, right? But when we have a social environment filled with type A people who are hyper aggressive and super competitive, then I'll cheat the mastery part of it just to make the target look good. If I'm always missing left and it's hurting my score, and people are looking at my target and making judgments about me, instead of figuring out how to hold the gun properly and squeeze the trigger without disrupting the sights, I'm just going to aim to the right, man, because it makes my target look better.
Now you don't have people snickering at you.
Right. And so now I'm focusing. So all we had to do was build a drill where we kind of tricked them into like, you're the only one that knows what the sight picture looks like. And so you have to tell us if that was a good shot or a bad shot, because what we're looking for is that round to impact exactly where your sight picture says it should. And if it did that, then repeat that action. If it didn't do that, make an adjustment. Make an adjustment in the pressure on the trigger, in the direction of the trigger, or the placement of your finger on the trigger. And so we gave them some actions that they could do. We gave them a ruler. We gave them the action. And then we just left them to their own devices so that they would stop looking at what their target looks like and start to use their target as a reflection of the action that created it. And once we got that connection down, now we're talking about mastering the task as opposed to just getting a good score.
Why not just say, and this is rhetorical, but also direct, why not just say, hey, fellas, we're all men here. I know that we all have the ability to let our ego dictate the way that we're operating. You guys all want to get a good outcome. Let's just drop the bullshit, stop caring what the guy to your left and right thinks, and focus on the fucking task at hand. Like, why not just do that instead of trying to veil things?
Because it's easier to veil it.
I figured that's what you were going to say.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're right. That would be nice to do. I've been able to influence smaller groups, like of 15 or less guys, to buy into that, where they're all on the same team and we can just talk about it like men and do things like that. If you have a group of 40 guys that's approximately 3-4 different teams all training together on a flat range, it's really difficult to do in a short amount of time. So we can just build a drill that allows them to do it without any kind of fear of judgment or retaliation, which, you've been around these guys long enough to know that their primary mode of communication is passive aggressive. And so if we can avoid that by just giving them a drill that makes them better shooters, or at least better marksmen, then it works more effectively, because we don't have to sit down and have a philosophical character talk and then just rely on all 40 of those guys to do it. Because as soon as 2 or 3 of them don't do it, the whole thing falls apart. Right? If we all sit down and say, all right, we're all men, we're all just going to put this thing down, we're going to put our egos down. In a very egocentric organization, we're all going to put our egos down and we're just going to get good at this stuff. And this is how training works anyway. And this is what the science says, and this is what this says, and this is the way the world works. We could get 35 of them to do it, but if 5 of them won't do it and 5 of them keep chirping at the next guy, then the whole thing falls apart. If we can just build a drill that allows them the freedom to miss without any kind of judgment and really just start to play with the fundamentals until they figure it out, because most of shooting fundamentals is dependent on what the nerds would call tacit feedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how many different times have you heard the pistol grip explained? Or how many different ways have you heard the pistol?
872,000. Oh, how many different ways? 413.
Yeah, right. Like, there's a ton of different ways that people will describe how to hold a pistol. But if you took a picture of all those different descriptions of that guy's grip, all those pictures would look exactly the same.
Sure.
So what that tells me, as the nerd with the PhD on the outside looking in, is that this isn't a procedural thing. This is a tacit feedback thing. And so whichever way you use to describe the pistol grip is the one that clicked with you, right? And whichever way I describe the pistol grip is the one that clicked with me. And so the more opportunity that we can give guys some left and right limits in terms of, like, hey, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, now go play with it until you figure it out, then without any judgment of, like, oh, my target looks bad, or I didn't get a good score, or I got a bad score, or whatever it is, then they get better faster that way, because they're not stupid. They're actually really, really intelligent. And sometimes that intelligence gets in the way because they also have, like, the type A quote unquote personality is driven by covert insecurity of status, which by definition provides low self-esteem because our expectations are higher than our realistic ability to produce outcomes. And therefore, we get a sense of time urgency where we need to be able to learn things instantly and be able to do things instantly. We are hyper aggressive because we want to get more things done than everybody else. And we have what they call free floating hostility, which means we're more likely to be hostile, like short fuse, right? And so if I put a bunch of type A people in a situation where we're going to train them, which means we're going to force them to fail a little bit because we're getting them to do something that's beyond their capability, they're going to get frustrated really, really fast because time urgency, right, speeds that up. Hyper aggressiveness speeds that up. And hostility prevents me from being able to play with something. And so if we can put them in a situation where they give themselves a little bit of opportunity to play with it, then it clicks for them because they were allowed the space to figure it out on their own with a little bit of guidance, right? Like, hey, we can't do this or we can't do that, but if you see this, then do this. If you see that, then do that. There's 3 options. Play with it. You got 75 rounds. Start playing with it. And by the end of, like, the last 15 rounds, when they put their grip back together, most guys can put 15 to 17 rounds in a 1-inch square at 3 meters.
Sure.
And they know exactly what those rounds are going. And they're like, what kind of Jedi mind trick did you just play on me? And I'm like, well, we just used some science to practice it more effectively.
I like to say principles, not mimicking a technique. Because I mean, not just talking like even mechanically, our hands are different, our grip strength's different. Like, and it could be jujitsu, it could be holding a baseball bat, but like we oftentimes like, well, how does that guy hold the bat, or how does he hold the ball, or how does he hold the gun? Well, it doesn't matter. That dude's a freaking professional athlete with 200 pounds of grip force. You're not. Like, you can't do it what he's doing. So, like, how do we harness the principles of what he's doing with your body instead of, like, what comment on that?
So what you're describing in my head is the critical path approach. And this is something that has gotten me quite a bit of credibility, for lack of a better word. But I'm listening. I grew up shooting cowboy guns in Montana, right? I'm not shooting semi-automatic rifles or semi-automatic pistols for that matter. I grew up deer hunting with a 270 with a fixed power, fixed 10 power scope on it. If the deer was a long ways away, we just held it a little bit higher. We didn't think about the wind or the spin of the earth or anything like that, right? And so I'm now here immersed into this special operations shooting course, and everybody's got a different opinion about everything. And so I just started listening for the commonalities, because I used to be a hitting coach, and you brought up baseball, and how does this professional hitter swing the bat? How does this one swing the bat? How does this one? The swings look different, but they have three things in common, right? And so, all right, what are the things that the good shooters do that they all have in common? And so that's the critical path. It doesn't matter how you do the rest of it, but you have to do these three things the same, right? And it generally comes down to, you have to understand sight alignment, whether you're shooting iron sights or red dots or fancy sniper scopes. You have to understand what sight alignment is. You have to understand what sight picture is, and then you have to be able to hold that sight picture and squeeze the trigger without disrupting it. And there are some ways that doesn't matter what your body size is, or what your body type is, or what your philosophical approach on the world is. There are some ways that just don't work that well. There are some ways that always work. All right. So how do we plug the 3 or 4 things in that make sense in your head? And now, as an instructor teaching 40 people 5 times a year, or in your case, thousands of people every year, then with your experience, your classes that you gave this week are probably different than the ones you did 10 years ago.
Heck yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because you've got this breadth of experience, and you've seen so many students struggle with the same thing over and over and over again. Then kind of that critical path is emerged in your head, and you're like, yep, we expect these mistakes. We expect these mistakes. These are the most common fixes. These are the second, if the most common fix doesn't work, this is the one that works. And it's usually in a way that you explain it more than like a physical action that you're having them do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so not only have you figured out the critical path for achieving marksmanship out of a student, but you've also figured out the critical path as an instructor, getting them to relate to the content that you're trying to share with them.
So you describe this concept as critical path teaching? Critical path.
Well, it comes out of, I can't remember which body of literature it comes out with, because it's been 10 years and I've just been using critical path because I now speak military better than I speak academics, just from being immersed in the world that I've been in for a long time. But the critical path approach comes, I think, out of the leadership literature, which is fuzzy at best, but it is a system of evaluation to figure out a problem set. And so if we've got enough data or enough examples of different groups of people trying to solve the same problem, then we look at the ones who are successful and we see what they do in common. We look at the ones that are unsuccessful and we see what they have in common. And pretty soon we figure out kind of what are the elements of the problem, right? And so what are the elements of marksmanship, right? We would call them fundamentals, right? So
essentials is what I'm calling them these days.
Calling them essentials? Yeah. So we're all talking about the same thing.
Like the thing you can't take away. Like if you're making chocolate chip cookies, you can't not have chocolate chips. You can't not have butter. You can't not have flour. Like you got to have this stuff to make the cookies.
Exactly. And if you want to shoot a semi-automatic pistol and you want to be able to shoot a 6-plate rack in under 7 seconds, then there are some things that you just have to do. Right?
Right.
Some things you just have to do. And a lot of that has to do with not only how you hold a gun, how you position your body and all that stuff. Like there's a lot of variables in that, in the way that people describe that. There's some pretty common things in terms of how you have to use your vision in order to do that effectively. And so once we start, but like we have to have some pretty good relationships with guys to have some open dialogue about what they're actually doing with their eyes and what they're actually looking at and what that thing looks like before we can unpackage it enough so that we can say it to 40 guys one time and they all think about the same thing.
So after all these years, are you still coming up with new stuff, or do you pretty well have a program down?
A little bit of both. The shooting world hasn't changed that much. There's always, the new hotness now that like everybody has the internet and everybody's on the internet, there's always the new hotness that's coming out of there. There's always arguments within the military world about like, this is the way that it has to be, and this is the way that it has to be, and you can't do this and you can't do that. But like, a pistol is still pretty much a pistol, right? Like the old Berettas that they used to shoot in early GWAT are not that much different than the Glocks that they shot late in GWAT that aren't that much different than the SIGs they're shooting now.
If those SIGs go off function as holster.
Well, sometimes they do, but allegedly, I have not seen one do that.
I'm just being a smartass. But yeah, you're still pointing a little metal too.
Yeah, it's still basically an L, and you hold one end of the L, and the bullet comes out of the other end of the L, and the slide does the same thing when you squeeze the bendy thing, right?
Right.
And so a lot of that stuff, as far as just marksmanship goes, hasn't really changed. I'm not a military guy. I'm regular tab guy, right? And so I don't get into their tactics. I understand their tactics well enough to help them figure out better ways to teach it and evaluate it, but I'm not going to tell them what tactics they should use or shouldn't use, but they'll argue that until they're blue in the face forever, right? And so am I coming up with new stuff? I haven't discovered a need for too much new stuff. The problem that I have in the military is that everybody changes jobs every couple of years. And so once we get a group of instructors kind of on the same page and they go through their little evolution of learning how to teach people how to shoot, and they're like good to go, and now we're just on kind of repeat mode, then we get two new guys and the cycle starts over. So it's kind of like a 18 to 24 month Groundhog Day.
Where you're like, hey guys, can I propose this?
Yeah.
But now you've got all this practice at proposing the same information over and over to some guy that doesn't think you've got
doesn't know why I'm here and doesn't know that I've been there for 10 years doing the same thing. And, and to their credit, that's what they're good at, is like, oh, I'm the guy that's going to come in and change everything or not change everything, but I'm the guy that's going to come in and have an impact because I've been chosen to be this instructor. That means I have to know all the answers. And so they were coming with their own background, with their own experience of what worked for them. It's like, I've seen this movie before. I know how it ends. I can predict the future here because I've seen enough guys go through the same cycle as they develop into really good instructors. And that's exactly what I'm doing, is just proposing things, right? Because I'm not in charge of anything. I don't have any authority to tell them what to do. I'm the third volunteer assistant coach. And so just because I know the answer doesn't mean that I'm the smartest person in the room. It means that I'm the only one that's seen all these guys go through this cycle before. And if we can shorten the cycle, then we'll do it. If we can shorten it by a month, that's better than nothing. If we can shorten it by 6 months, that's good. If we could do what you're talking about, where we can all just sit down in a room and say, hey, listen, this is why things run the way they do. This is why they teach the classes that they teach. This is why the order of drills is put in this order. And everybody could just be like, oh, you mean this is what has been happening here for 10 years? Everybody's gone through the same cycle. Why do we have to go through the cycle? Why don't we just do it the way that it works? That would be great. But that's not the world that we live in. We live in the world where I've got my knowledge of what's made me good, and I really, with all pure good intentions, genuinely want to share it with people of my element or my unit or my group. Then why am I listening to this guy that I just met for the first time? What does he know about anything? And now we're back to like the outsider looking in, and so it's just a cycle of being repetitive about that stuff. But I've learned a lot.
Are you specifically working with the shooting program there, or are you involved in other stuff?
I'm involved in a little bit of everything.
Okay.
I've been working with a lot of the shooting stuff. That's kind of just by happenstance, the first day on the job, they're like, hey, you're going to go out there and watch these guys, because that's what we do with the new guys, just to kind of see what they do. And then because they were teaching and coaching up there, and that's where my expertise lies, is teaching and coaching. It just seemed like a pretty natural fit. And then that kind of like direct action stuff evolved into, hey, this guy's helped us with our shooting. Hey, sniper cadre, this guy could probably help you. And then that got me out into the units a little bit more. So now I'm working with individual teams or individual elements within the organization. And so there's a lot of shooting stuff, but I also am involved with the other things that they train on. And that's anything from leadership development to communication, very specific communication strategies, to building better programs of instruction, to monitoring their expenditures and how they can recover better, and how to kind of like adjust to the cycle of being deployed for 6 months and then being home for 6 months and then being gone for 6 months or a year or whatever their current op tempo looks like. So it's a little bit of, sometimes it's a mile wide and an inch deep, and sometimes it's an inch wide and a mile deep. And the only thing that stays the same is that everything constantly changes. So it's pretty dynamic day, right?
So let's unpack a couple things there. Communication. And that's as broad as any topic under the sun. What are some things that you're helping that like listeners, viewers here can apply? Business people, coppers, whoever. Like, what are some? How are you helping people communicate more effectively or efficiently or better?
Well, it's going to be a little bit vague in that I'm not trying to be intentionally vague. I'm just trying to. There's some things that we're going to stay that are we're just going to leave alone. But let's think about it like this: who do you have to communicate with, and why do you have to communicate with them? And so they communicate with each other amongst their teams, and so that's a little bit different. They have to communicate with their command. That has a different intention, right? Audience and purpose usually drives your communication approach. And then they have to communicate with their partner forces, or they have to communicate with other elements overseas. And then that's a different audience and a different purpose. And so part of me helping them communicate is like, what's your audience and what's your purpose? Because that's going to help them strategize what kind of language they need to use, whether that's tone, inflection, whether that's slang or technical, could be anything under the sun on that realm. What about I need you to agree with me? So some persuasion or influence. There's very specific communication strategies for that, that work both with the team, with the command, with their partners overseas, whether that's foreign or domestic. And so really it just gets down into, it's not really that much different than teaching them shooting or teaching them like how to teach shooting. Like, don't get me wrong, like I'm not teaching them how to shoot their gun. I've learned enough about it that I can help them be better instructors so that they can teach their guys how to shoot better. In the same way I'm doing the communication, right? Is that if I can help a team sergeant and a captain communicate more effectively, then I can help a team sergeant communicate to his NCOs more effectively. Then I can teach a captain how to communicate to his company commander more effectively, because at the end of the day, it comes down to some pretty basic principles of understanding the other person's position, their interests, their priorities, their values. And then as long as I have some genuine credibility as a speaker, which means I have to pick the right code to speak in, whether I'm speaking in slang or using profanity or being very technical and professional, that establishes my credibility. Then I need to make some connection to their values, right? Ethos, pathos, logos hasn't changed since Socrates was around. I can make my content relate to them and some of their values. And then all I got to do is put it together in a logical flow that leads them down the path so that they understand what I'm talking about. If I can build that into it, then I understand it. Then I have a better understanding of what their values, interests, priorities, and goals are. And now we can communicate more effectively because I can not only communicate my interests, values, priorities, goals, but I can do it in a way that matches with theirs, or at least compares and contrasts with theirs, so that we understand effectively where we both stand. And now if we have a mutual goal, we can direct that communication towards the mutual goal. Or if I'm trying to talk you out of something, then I understand how to present that information to you in a way that you'll listen first and then communicate back. And now we can have a pretty legitimate argument because we've made an implicit agreement that we're both here for the mutual benefit of each other.
It seems like where most arguments don't start. I'm here to make you understand you're stupid and wrong.
Right. And so when you tell a bunch of special operations guys that we're going to talk about active listening today, they think like, oh, I'm going to nod and say, when I come home and my wife is telling me a story that takes 500 words that, one of the guys at work would have told me in 5 words. And so my active listening is I'm just going to like, yep. Oh, no, she didn't. Right. You know what I mean? And so
I'm just joking, ladies.
If we really break down active listening as a quote unquote tactical skill, then what am I listening for? I want to understand what your goals are. I want to understand what you value. I want to understand who you want to be or who you want people to think you are. And if I can understand that, then I can very effectively communicate with you so that we can meet our goals. Even if my goal as the instructor is to get you to understand the actions that I'm trying to get you to follow, I still need to understand some of those things so that I can communicate with you more effectively. Right. Yeah. Or if the captain and the team sergeant aren't on the same page about what's important, then we need to understand why. Because if I can't understand your point of view, then I'm not going to listen to you because you're just wrong. And whatever you say doesn't matter. But that's not true in a relationship. What you think and what you say does matter, whether it's a professional relationship or a personal relationship. So I have to weaponize my active listening skills, and I have to actively listen, not just to the words that you say, but what those words reflect about who you are. What are your goals? What are your interests? What are your priorities? What are your values? And all I got to do is make a connection to those things. And now I can communicate very effectively with you.
I dig it.
So from a communication standpoint, without getting into the specifics, but that's essentially what the instruction in communication is that, one, do you have a goal that you want to communicate? Like, communication at the fundamental level is I have an idea in my head and I'm trying to get you to have the same idea in your head. Right?
Sure.
So, okay, that's pretty simple. Hey, it's hot out today, right? Oh yeah, it's hot. Well, that's easy communication because we're both experiencing the same thing. But when I said it was hot out the first time, that's just an example. The guy standing next to me is like, it's not as hot as it is in the Middle East. It ain't hot. It was 130 degrees last month. This is nice. It's only 90 degrees here. All right, well, he's got different values then on what it means to be hot. I just learned something about him. So if I need to communicate with him, I know something about the way that he looks at the world now. So now if I'm going to talk about like, man, it's too hot for these guys to be out here, I have to take into consideration what he thinks is hot. Right, wrong, or indifferent, right?
Sure.
And so if we're just talking about improving our communication, it could be even on target. We know that the average from the literature in judgment and decision making, we know that most people can process 3 things at a time very, very effectively. If we add one more thing to it, then we can expect one of the 4 to be dropped. And so if you're giving me directions in a SWAT team kind of raid, and you tell me like, hey, we're going to go to this room and then to this room and to this room, and we'll be back at the door that we're at, I'm not going to remember the directions that you just gave me. But if I say, hey, go left, hit the next door on the right, boom, I can do that all day long. And then when we get to that room, all right, go right, hit the next door on the left. All right, cool, we're there. All right, go left, next door on the right. Boom, now we're back to where we started. But if you give me all that direction at the front end, I just can't process that because I have other things that I'm looking for in my environment, right? And even if we think about how people in one of your classes, their experience in one of your classes is nobody wants to look bad. We can generally assume that. If I'm going to pay you to come so that I can come get your expertise and experience and some education from you, then I want to be able to perform well because we don't just live in this physical environment. We live in a social environment and we live in an emotional environment. And so I have to consider all of those things when I'm thinking about how much direction can you process right now. Because if I'm the brand new shooter in your class and you open up with a drill and everybody knows what you're talking about except for me because I bought a gun yesterday and I came to you to learn how to use it, and you say, hey, we're going to shoot at El Pres, and everybody's like, oh, yeah, El Pres, yeah, this is going to be awesome. And they start describing it El Pres, and I have no idea what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Then you give me El Pres directions. I've already got at least two things that I'm processing on top of your directions. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So you have to give me, you would have to, in order for our communication to be perfect, which doesn't really exist, but that's the ideal, then you're going to have to give me very specific step-by-step instructions, no more than 2 steps at a time. You're going to turn, you're going to look to this target, you're going to shoot 2 rounds into that box. Then you're going to point your gun at that target, you're going to shoot 2 rounds into that box. Then you're going to point your gun at that target, and you're going to shoot 2 rounds into that box. Understand? Yeah, I understand. All right, what are you going to do? I'm going to turn, and then I'm going to do what now? Right? So that's not good instruction. That's too much. Hey, turn around. See the 3 targets? Yep. All right. See the boxes in the middle of them? Yep. We're going to put 2 rounds in each one of those boxes. That's only 2 things to do. Turn, rounds, and boxes. So I'm standing in the back listening to instructors talk, and I'm watching students and watching how they process the information and watching how that based on their actions when they're told to do it. And if 30% of them, rough estimate, 30% of them don't get it, we have an instructor problem. We don't have a student problem. We have an instructor problem. All right. So what's the student experience? What are all the things that they're processing? Is there anything that we can influence as instructors to take some of that load off so that they can focus on what they're supposed to be doing? Now we're back to, now it starts to weave all back together, right? With the communication and the actual teaching.
It seems like, as you start to dig into these things, it seems like some people have intuition on these things. Like plenty of the stuff you're talking about makes good sense to me. I just haven't heard certain terms applied to them, right? Maybe like a mom does a really good job of understanding like that a child feels a certain way, and maybe it's not her kid. She can see that the kid's scared or hurt or whatever. Whereas dad would be like, "What the hell are you crying about?" And like not into it.
Right.
I have that intuition about that stuff. It's there's so many of these variables. Communication being one of them. When I was talking about it, I wasn't saying like, what do you do with this specific special operations unit? Like, what's their secret sauce that they're doing? But this stuff can be daunting. Good sales guys, a good communicator, sales manager, right?
Yep.
You're not doing real good this week, Bob. I got to talk to you about it. And that stuff's kind of annoying because Bob's kicked ass for years and years. And then he just maybe has a string of bad luck with customers, but sales managers got numbers to make. So then they bring Bob in and they're going to give him, we always call it the short bus in the sales world. You got to go on the short bus so that you can figure out how to talk to customers like you've executed day after day, year after year, and you got the sales awards and the trophies and the vacations out of it. So clearly you didn't just forget how to do that. Like that type of stuff seems to come up so often where we exhibit good skills in an area or an arena, and then we don't. I guess in baseball it'd be a slump, right? Like you're a great batter, and then all of a sudden you're getting struck out or walked all the time and not getting any at bat or any hits. Like, how do we deal with that? And then like there's a whole mental component to that too, right? Where now I'm like, there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. I'm stupid. Like, what the hell's happening? And then like we self-sabotage. Like, talk about that kind of stuff a little bit.
All right, that's a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot
there.
there, but I just was kind of like,
no, you're right. The communication, if we have a communication problem, that's usually a cop out because people aren't really thinking about the tactical side of communication. And when I say tactical, I'm not talking about like guns and bombs and stuff, but like if you and I are going to play baseball, then we're going to have very specific strategies that we're going to employ to win the game, and those are our tactics, right? And so if it boils down into a stress component, where if we're talking about the salesman that had a bad month, or we're talking about the hitter that has a slump, that's where what I call, like in the sport world, we would call it sport IQ, right? And so if we're playing baseball, we know that a 300 average is an all-star. That's the old saying. And we know that a 300 average means that I failed 7 times out of 10. Right?
sure.
We can agree on that? That's how baseball works? Okay. So that's not how professional hitters think about it. Professional hitters think about how hard, like I've got 3 hits in the last 10 at bats, but out of those 7 at bats, I smoked 7 balls. 4 of them just got caught. So I'm not in a slump because I'm still hitting. I'm doing the thing that creates the hits better than I've ever done it before. But those other 8 guys that are playing defense have been standing in the same spot for 150 years for a reason. That's where all the hits go, right?
Yeah.
Once I understand that, like, I'm not in a slump, I'm crushing it. Now, if it goes to the point where, like the old Chuck Knobloch example, where you get the yips or something like that, that's a different problem altogether. But the salesman example is along the same way. If that guy's been that good of a salesman that long, then he his domain IQ instead of sport IQ, his domain IQ, right? Like shooters have the same thing. Like shooters have an IQ about like, man, I'm just not feeling it today. Something's off. Their expertise that they've derived from their experience, it usually goes back to some sort of fundamental focus for a while to get them back on track, right? And if I understand all the components that I have to put together in order to make this bullet hit this target, whether that target is 3 meters away or 1,500 meters away, then, and I'm doing it really good, and then all of a sudden I can't do it anymore. That's just not true. Because you can do it. You've demonstrated that you can do it. There's some part of your process that you're failing to recognize, right? It's the old PCCs, PCIs. Like you're not doing your checklist to get you ready to go. And so when we talk about this in terms of guys having good
PCC, PCI means
pre-combat inspections, pre-combat checks, right? Like, is your light, did you check your batteries and your lights and lasers and your optics? And, do you have all of your stuff? Is it in working condition? Do you know how to fix it? Stuff like that, right? It's like you were talking about earlier, your example of the guy who his optic falls off his gun. And it's like, man, 3 years in a row, your optic's still falling off your gun. Why can't you do your inspections before you start shooting? Right? Then so if the guy goes into the quote unquote slump, then if he's not been trained and he doesn't have any mastery, then yeah, he's in a slump. But if he has some mastery, then he doesn't really believe in a slump. He knows that he's competent. He knows that there's something that he's failing to do that's not producing the results that he wants. There's some part of the environment that he's not recognizing correctly that's changed, or there's something that he's just failing to do to prepare himself to go do that. And that's not always the easy conversation to have with guys because they have to own some of that, because there's the egocentric part of this is that this is largely like, if you believe you're a good shooter, then you are. And if you believe you're a bad shooter, you certainly are a bad shooter.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I was going to dovetail into that. I'm going to let you finish your point.
But that's the point at the end of the day is like, okay, if you believe you're a bad shooter, that's a harder well to dig out of than if you're having a bad day and you think you're in a slump. Because if you're just in a slump, then we go back to a fundamental or something, and I insult your intelligence by saying like, hey, how's your grip? How's your trigger? Like, is it plugged in? Right? Like when you call IT because your computer doesn't work, what's the first thing they ask you? Is it plugged in? Is it turned on?
It got
right?
batteries in it. Yeah.
Did you change the batteries? Is the battery dead? And so it usually goes back to one of those things, because we certainly have the domain IQ to understand like all the foreseeable problems and why we can't accomplish whatever objective we're trying to accomplish, whether it's shooting or sales or whatever it is that we're after. And so we just go back to that. That's the answer. And it's where one of the things that's become glaringly apparent to me in my experience is that most of our most complicated problems have the simplest answers, and therefore we are very, very careful about confusing simple with easy. Right? We don't confuse simple with easy. And the reason that we don't confuse simple with easy is because simple is important. And if we're going to get to a high level of anything, then the simplest thing, like why is it that when you ask when you hear an interview with anybody that's been at the top of their field for a long time, how they dealt with the most pressure situation, whether it was making a free throw in a basketball game or throwing a strike to end a no-hitter or making the sale or whatever, why is it that they always talk about fundamentals?
Yeah.
Right? Like I've had a relatively unique opportunity to talk to a bunch of different people who have been in a bunch of different gunfights in a bunch of different contexts. And one of the things that is consistent throughout all of those discussions is that there's no such thing as an advanced gunfight. Right? That's the old saying, you always fall to the level of your training. You never rise to the occasion, you always fall to the level of your training. Well, naive me 10 years ago was like, well, why don't you train for the occasion? Which I still believe is true. But if we're going to fall to the level of our fundamentals under stress, or fall to the level of our training under stress, right? Like the training just takes over, then those simple things are the most important things. Right? And it's not easy to do that well every single time. And the way that translates into my 10 to 12-year-old baseball team that I coach, right, is that the hardest thing that you'll ever ask yourself to do is give your best effort every single time you get an opportunity. Right? Because now we're talking about the things that like Z likes to talk about, the rivers and streams and dams of what it means to be a man and live in a world of like being accountable to ourselves all the time. And that's a really, really simple concept, but it's very, very difficult to execute. Right? Mm-hmm. If we think about it from a more of a sports psych lens per se, then what are the two things that are always in our control? It always comes down to attitude and effort. Right? If we define attitude a little bit more operationally, it's a decision we make to think and act about the things that we encounter. If we think about effort, it's a expenditure of mental and or physical power as means to an end. If those two things are always in our control, then that's a pretty simple concept. Mm-hmm. But anybody that's ever tried to do anything knows that it's extremely difficult to do. Extremely difficult to do. So we don't confuse simple with easy. And if we do encounter a problem, whether it's a complex problem or not, then the answer is usually pretty simple, but it's relatively difficult to execute. So we need some strategies. And those strategies are usually domain specific.
That makes sense. And by domain, you're saying the boardroom is different than the battlefield, is different than a marathon race, is different than playing baseball, is different than XYZ.
Yep.
Gotcha. That makes good sense.
Right, because they all have it's a different context, right?
Right. I can't punch you or shoot you in the boardroom.
Correct.
I can't run in circles in there.
Nope. I mean, you can, but it's not going to solve your problems.
Yeah, it would be weird. It would be weird.
It's going to cause you more problems down the road. And, it just seems to be true. It doesn't, it leaves most people a little bit unsatisfied because it's like, well, shit, that doesn't really give me anything to work with. But it goes back to like when you're teaching people in your courses, you've had plenty of people struggle with things that you think are like, how can you, like, I'm lost right now. I don't know how else to get you to understand this. Everyone else I've ever said this to understood it perfectly, right? Well, usually in that situation, that means that their ability to recognize the environment means different things to them. And I guess are you familiar with the OODA loop?
Of course. I don't believe in
Of
it in the
course.
context of how it's often taught, but yes.
I probably agree with you on that too. But the OODA loop is a thing that obviously John Boyd built as a TTP for dogfighting, and it's been bastardized into a decision-making process. But we can
that
the thing
took
that
him
really
hours to discuss, and we say it in one little cute circle.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
For the listeners, real quick, OODA, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, was Colonel John Boyd, Air Force Colonel. That there's a great book on him called Boyd. You can read about him, but just so that you understand the context of what the doc is talking about.
Right. And so the most important part of the OODA loop from a teaching and learning perspective is the connection between observe and orient, right? Because that's where the domain specificity comes in. Mm-hmm. So if we're in a boardroom and somebody starts punching somebody, that action is oriented, gives us, like, we observe that. The orient part, as best as I can figure from Boyd, is that gives us meaning to what we see. Right?
I agree.
So if I'm in one of your classes and I know that we're going to do some like hand-to-hand fighting stuff for a concealed carry class so that you can teach me how to more effectively get my weapon out in a confrontation, and I see you punch somebody, then that's the same action as you punching somebody in a boardroom, right? Punch is a punch is a punch, but it has two completely different meanings when I see it based on the domain that I'm in, right? Sure. And if you break down the orient part of the OODA loop, then Boyd's got 5 different factors that are all interconnected that orientate us to a meaning of what we observe, right? And then the feed forward and feedback loops start to catch up, and that's how we outloop our opponents, right? Mm-hmm. But the outloop part is dependent on our domain IQ. We need to know precisely what those things mean when we see them, or when we feel them, or when we sense them. You know, we've got lots of senses, but you know what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about domain specificity, and whether it's sales, like, I'm not a salesperson. I've never had to do that. And I'm frankly probably not that good at it, because in my head, if it works, you buy it. If it doesn't, you won't, and I don't really care. But if I've been doing sales for 10 years, I know more about interacting with customers. And so my observations are more acute because I've got 10 years of experience doing it. Right? Mm-hmm. If I try to sell something to you right now, I'm going to focus on the product. But I would wager, and I don't know this, but I would wager that if somebody who's been in sales for 20 years, they're not focused on the product, they're focused on the customer. And their observations are giving them more information about the customer because they can orient themselves because they've seen it so many times. The same way that you do probably in your classes on your flat range, where you're giving the same instruction over and over and over and over, but you're less interested in what the gun is doing and probably more interested in how the students are responding to what you say.
100%.
And you say, oh, I've seen that reaction before. And to somebody who's never taught anybody how to do anything, it just looks like people listening to somebody talking, right? But you're observing things that a novice wouldn't even notice, right? And so if we're going to use the OODA loop to be good at anything, or if we're going to try to explain what domain IQ means, then it really means about, like, what is it that you're observing? How finite is what you're observing? And how does your experience shape how that orients you to the problem?
I like that.
And then we can go way down the rabbit.
Go ahead.
I mean, after that, like, if you want to go OODA loop, we can go way down the rabbit hole with OODA loop, but, like, because then it gets into all the decision-making models.
Sure.
that have been developed since Boyd. But because remember, Boyd's OODA loop wasn't really a decision-making model. It was a TTP for gun. So,
and the part about that people don't understand, you just touched on it, was he was also talking to dudes that had this exponentially greater understanding of a very specific problem, and guys have now turned orient into like turn and look, like or literally physically change your hips so that your plates are facing the target. It's like that ain't what this dude was talking about at all.
It's not,
like not even remote.
Not even close.
No.
No, not even close. Not even close. So yeah, anytime somebody at work asks me about an OODA loop, I kind of have the same like, what do you mean by OODA loop? Because it's
guys will say he got inside his OODA. Like,
yeah, I got inside his OODA. I'm like, okay, cool. Tell me about that.
You're talking about sales stuff a minute ago, talking about the lifelong salesman talking to the person rather than about the product. A book years ago I read, it was written in the 80s. It was like by a master salesman teaching you how to be a closer. And he tells a story about himself. And I believe he sold insurance. And he had decided, this author, and this is before the internet, so when this book was written, books were king. He had decided if and when I reach this certain level of success, I'm going to go buy a Porsche. And so he does it. He makes the money and he walks in the Porsche dealership, and the salesman comes up and he's got like cash in hand, or he's got his checkbook. He's going to just buy this Porsche. He says, I want that Porsche right there. And the guy's like, really? Why do you want that? And he goes, and he tells him, the author tells the Porsche salesman, he's like, this is the car, man. I've been dreaming about this thing. It's going to be in my garage. And the sales guy goes, you don't want that Porsche. He goes, you want this car. He walks over and he points at this other one. It looks almost identical. And he goes, well, why do I want this one? He walks him around the back and he points, and it says turbo. And he goes, it was a turbo 911. He goes, well, what the hell does that do? He goes, I have no clue, but the chicks like this one better. So he spends the extra 10 or 20 grand and he buys that one. And, he's teaching you, the reader, like it was an emotional connection that this salesman had. He's like, chicks, that sounds great. Sign me up. He goes, I had no idea. Neither of them understood that the turbo compressed, supercharged air into the engine and blah, blah, blah. It just meant it was more expensive and the chicks dug it. And so he ended up buying it. And that always stuck with me after I read that. I read it 25 years ago. It made me pop in my head when you're talking about that.
No, that's exactly what it is. The salesman. That's right. Salesman observed something that oriented him to like, I can get 20 more grand out of this guy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it worked.
Right. That's the right. That also leads to, this isn't taught necessarily in sports psychology stuff, but it's something that I picked up early here. It's the illusion of explanatory depth. Right. That's what we're talking about with the illusion of explanatory depth, right? Like, I know how to use a toilet, but I don't know that I can explain exactly how a toilet works. Like, I know how to shoot a gun, but I don't know that I could explain exactly how a gun works, right? And I think that we're inundated with so much information, and we're capable of processing so much information compared to even like 100 years ago, that it makes a lot of sense logistically. So I'm not like trying to be derogatory about it at any level, but in order to be an effective instructor or coach or mentor, then you have to have that explanatory depth. And that's where you get this domain IQ from, is like, not only do you understand how to do this thing, but you understand how all of the components work by themselves. And once you understand how all the components work by themselves, then you understand how they all work together to achieve this thing that's bigger than any of the individual parts, right? And that's the part that's always kind of fascinated me about the military guys, is that nobody really understands them and their experience that's not one of them having the same experience. And there's a lot of those illusions running around, even in the military. And so if I'm going to be a better communicator with those guys, then I'm fighting against that kind of illusion that I have of explanatory depth. Like, I know how this works. Okay, cool. Break it down for me so that I can understand it better. And I can't sometimes, and that's my slump, right? Like we're talking about, and so that's my mental cue to be like, okay, I need to be educated on this before I can go spout off answers that may or may not be effective. Right? And the OODA loop is a prime
impacts.
Yeah, OODA loop is a prime example of that illusion of explanatory depth, right? It's like, oh, it just means like you have to turn your plates towards it. That's how you orient yourself to the observation. But anyway, that's how my little brain works. Squirrel. Sidebar.
Something that I wouldn't say that you're a squirrel. No, I think you're pretty focused from what I can gather. Here's something that I wanted to make sure I chatted about with you. So I am a huge proponent of Z, and I appreciate each other because we both tend to be more introspective about things. If it didn't work, it's probably my fault, or how can I do this better, or self-talk. So that's where I was getting to with this. So self-talk, visualization, etc. Something that I spent years working on, but also trying to explain. And for me, it sounds like you have weeks and months with guys, maybe even years sometimes. Sometimes I have hours with people. And I've been accused of and guilty of trying to do too much. For me, I want to provide value to people. And of course, I've got a deceased family member. His name was Mike. He always would say, don't try to have a whole summer in one day. You're not going to go to you're not going to have a picnic, jet ski, water ski, picnic again and have s'mores and, everything all at once. Don't try to have a whole summer in one day. And so like one of my main objectives with students, all the shooting shit, I'll put all that stuff aside, is to help people with the understanding of self-talk and visualization. Because like you already said, like the pointing of an L-shaped metal plastic object really is kind of dumb and simple, right? Maybe it's not so easy, but it's a fairly simple task. And so I've met guys, not every Green Beret's the same human, right? We're all cross sections, or every Navy SEAL, or every astronaut, or every fighter pilot. And of course, there's some guys that are straight up pricks, and maybe some were abused as kids, and some were had the best parents, and et cetera. But I've noticed some of them are really good at this, and some are not, just like any humans would be. But I would think in a space where like life and death are on the line, there would be more investment into visualization and self-talk. So like, kind of comment on that kind of stuff a little bit.
I came in with the same assumption. I think there is some literature to support that there's a certain percentage of the population that is incapable of self-talk, that don't have an internal dialogue. But really? I've encountered very few.
It seems like we all have some shit rattling around up there.
And that's common to my experience as well. But there is some, it's the evidence-based thing that I'm always tagged with. So I always caveat things with what I know or have been told to be true about it. So I've not experienced somebody that just can't do it. I've had some people reach out to me that says, hey, I've been trying to teach this self-talk and visualization that you taught me, and this person just is like, can't even fathom what I'm talking about. What is the deal? And that's, so I got into the literature to try to help that guy, and turned out that there is a certain percentage of the population that just doesn't have an internal dialogue. Notwithstanding, the vast majority of people do. And when we're talking about people who volunteer to have a profession of life and death, they tend to think about self-talk and visualization as a pretty soft skill, right? Like you either have it or you don't. You either have the edge or you don't. And so it takes a considerable amount of relationship building and trust to get to the point where we can do some valuable work with self-talk and visualization. The surface level of it, though, is pretty obvious, is that when you're giving instruction, you're doing visualization. If you're going to give me an instruction so that I can do whatever action you want me to do for this drill as part of your POI, as you describe it, right, you're probably mimicking it as you describe it. And therefore, you're forcing me to visualize myself doing it. Right. So we know like I said, the vast majority of people are capable of this. When we start doing visualization and self-talk intentionally or on purpose, it gets a little bit weird, because if we're not willing to go introspective, then we're going to have a high resistance to application. Right. Mm-hmm. So if you were to encounter a bunch of special forces guys and say, hey, let's talk about self-talk and visualization, I don't want to do this because I'm just not that introspective. Visualization is probably our most powerful mental skill. It is definitely a skill. It is definitely something that you can learn. It is definitely something that you can improve. And it is very powerful. And the thing that we have to remember about anything that has value is that it can be used for good or evil, right? Because the way that the mechanics of our brain work is that our brain doesn't have a value state, like a value gauge in it. It's like just gets good at whatever you practice the most. So if you consistently see yourself failing in whatever situation you're anticipating, then if you get into that situation and you don't have time to make a deliberate decision, then it just goes on autopilot and does what you've practiced the most. There's lots of repeatable research studies that show that we can increase your strength with visualization, that we can decrease the time to heal injuries with visualization, but you have to be like full in on the belief of the visualization in order for that to work. So we know that visualization is effective, and therefore it's effective. So we have to be careful about it, because if I put you in a situation like you're going to go do this big speech at the next shooting instructor convention that probably doesn't exist, but like, let's say you're going to go to SHOT Show and you're going to be a keynote speaker, and everybody that goes to SHOT Show is going to be there to listen to you talk about what you think is the best way to teach people how to shoot, right? As you prepare for that, you're going to visualize yourself like giving this talk. It's going to happen because that's how you think about it. If you see yourself misspeaking, or if you see the situation unfold where a bunch of people are booing you and calling bullshit and doing all this other thing, and you crumble, then that's what you're practicing doing, right? That's the Lanny Bassam model. You've talked to Lanny Bassam. I'm sure that you've read his book,
With Winning in Mind.
With Winning in Mind. He outlines it pretty effectively in that book. The literature supports certainly his use of it. So we can visualize ourselves into failure just as well as we can visualize ourselves into success. The number one thing about our visualization skills is that we have to control it. That's the baseline.
Hard.
What's that?
But it's hard.
It is hard. It's very hard. It's exceptionally difficult. And so what we have to do is we have to know that it can be used for good or bad. And because it's a skill and because it has tremendous influence on how we interact with our environment, then when we see ourselves fail, or when we see something go wrong, or when we see ourselves not living up to the person that we want to be, then we have to take control over that, acknowledge that those things can happen, and then use our instant replay, because it's ours, we own it, instant replay. And whether we believe it or not, we just have to see ourselves doing it in the most ideal fashion possible.
It can't be that simple.
It is that simple. But
I have Go ahead.
No, it's that simple. I mean, we could get into the skill set of it.
I do want to talk about that if you've got a few more minutes.
If I ask you, yeah, sure. If you've got, go ahead.
I've spent years working on this stuff, years, and I still catch myself. I've tried to like find, let me rephrase that. I have delineated a few, I use them with the students just like I have touch points where I contact the rifle, like a cheek weld. I have mental set points where it's like, okay, I did this thing that's not acceptable, and here's how I like recock my thought patterns. I was in a jiu-jitsu tournament a couple of years ago, and I don't do a lot of that. And I did not want to invest all the energy and resources and then have a bad outcome. So I had not done this in years, and I haven't done it since, but I like partitioned out time daily to sit and go through some, like what I would say would be like advanced visualization techniques, where I like sat quietly and I imagined like the smell of the gym or the freaking competition center. I imagined being calm, sitting, waiting for my turn. I imagined the feeling of my gi on my neck. Anyway, I did all that stuff, and I got a really good outcome, and I won, and I got a gold medal, blah, blah, blah. But a couple of my buddies from the gym who are really good jiu-jitsu practitioners, I'd never been to a competition with them before. And so like leading up to it, 6 months out, this is going to be cool. This is going to be great. 3 months out, there's a lot going on in life. I wonder if I should have signed up. Month out, fuck, my shoulder's been acting up. I hope it's going to be okay. Like week of, I just showed up. So like I got that going for me. Nobody could take that away. Just showing up means a lot. Day of, like freaking deer in the headlights kind of look. And then like 10 minutes before on the edge of the mat, like there must be some kind of like air conditioning problem here. I can't breathe. I'm like, dude, I might have an allergic reaction to the soap that we used last night at the hotel. Like my heart's pounding, and at that point I'm like, I ain't got anything for you right now. I'm going to go sit and do my thing over here. Like you chose to do this. And that was about like, for me, because I was so aware those couple of months to watch it like unfold like that. And they both did very poorly. There wasn't some like, they didn't like muster some like internal, Babe Ruth batter syndrome and like crush it. They freaking, shit the bed, as they say. So like, as a guy that professionally does talk about this stuff.
So you did the skill development part of it, right? What I'm talking about with control, that's your fundamental. Like if nothing else in your visualization, take control over it. What you're talking about is some skill development where you could put yourself in all of the senses. What does it smell like on the mat? What does your gi smell like? What does it feel like against your skin? What does it feel like when the pressure increases? What does it feel like? What is it going to sound like? What does it look like? What's the environment feel like? And you're replicating all of that in your head, and it's called functional equivalence. So if we put people in an fMRI, functional equivalence, if we put them in an MRI, like an fMRI machine where we can actively see their brain activity, and you show them a picture of a jiu-jitsu tournament, or you start talking about a jiu-jitsu tournament, or you ask them to describe a jiu-jitsu tournament, the same parts of their brain get activated, right? That's the theory on functional equivalence. And so what you did is you were doing jiu-jitsu training in your visualization. You were seeing yourself respond, because we know that jiu-jitsu is a series of moves and counter moves, moves and counter moves, moves and counter moves, right? And so you saw yourself in the environment, you acknowledged the nervousness, and how am I going to deal with that? All right, so everything was prepared. That's what you practiced. It's no different than you going at some level, right? There's a skill, like I said, this is a skill that you have to develop. But if you've developed that skill to a certain point, then your brain doesn't differentiate between reality and imagination. And we know this is true because there's been a time where you've been not quite asleep, but not all the way awake, and you started to dream, and something happened in your dream, and your body responded exactly the way that you were in your dream. You've had that experience before?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So at that point, rationally, your brain knows that you're safe in your bed. All right. But rationally, also, we know that your brain just activated your body to respond exactly to the environment that was in your brain. Right. So functional equivalence. So if we can increase your visualization skill, and this takes some pretty deliberate and concentrated effort to do this, but if we can increase your visualization skill, then we can get you a lot of training reps in a very short amount of time, very effective training reps that will supplement your physical practice better than anything else. But on the baseline,
Supplement it, not take the place of it.
right. It's a very strong supplement. It's not a substitute, right? Like I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if you've never done jujitsu a day in your life, you've never been on a mat, right? But you've been around it, you've been to tournaments, you've seen it, you've watched it on TV, and now you've never tried to overcome another person's inertia with your inertia, or with your force or will, and you've never done jujitsu. I'm not going to tell you that you could visualize yourself doing it and win a gold medal. Right? Like, you have to practice the skill. But once you understand the skill, then you understand all the sensations and all the feelings, and you can put yourself there. And now you've got some material that you can use to practice with your visualization. Right? That's one of the main prescriptions for visualization is skill enhancement or skill acquisition. But we have to have some experience with that skill so that we know what it feels like to have that good cheek weld. We know what it feels like to have that solid, stable, durable platform to shoot from. We know what it feels like when the slide just glides over our grip instead of like jumps all over the place when we press the trigger. Once we have those feelings and we have those sensations, we can replicate those in our visualization system. And now we're getting really effective training reps, right? But at the base level, if you don't have that skill set developed and you start to see yourself fail, then you have to be able to stop that. And that's control. That's the most important category of all the skill sets within visualization. Does that make sense to you?
So that part where individual sees themselves fail, or this visualization thing's hard. What if I get laughed off the stage? What if the customer tells me no? What if the opponent submits me? What if I get shot in the face? How do you stop that dialogue? That's the part that I and everybody seems to struggle with.
All right. So you don't stop the dialogue. What you do is you've just given yourself another drill to work out. Right. And that's one of Lanny Bassam's approaches, just so that we have something in common. But if for anybody that hasn't read that book with winning in mind, they should definitely pick it up if you're interested in shooting and any kind of mental performance stuff, because it's really, really good. But if I remember the story correctly, the story of Lanny Bassam was that he was the best shooter in the world. And the only person that ever even came close to him was his teammate. And they got to the Olympics and they got to the gold medal match, and his teammate won, and Lanny knew that he choked. Right? So he goes back to Texas and he goes to see a psychologist because he knows that it was a mental problem. And the psychologist says, "What's your problem?" And he says, "Oh, well, I'm number 2 in the world and I need to be number 1 in the world." And the psychologist says, "Oh, no problem. 2 weeks of therapy with me, you'll be perfectly okay with being number 2. And Lanny's like, "That's not what I'm here for, dude. Get out of here." Right? And so he started thinking about, like, I think what he calls it is that's like me. And so that's visualization in a more of a social setting, not necessarily a skill development, right?
It's like me to win.
If I'm in the most pressure situation that I can imagine, how do I want to be? And then I have to just practice playing imaginary games of, like, I'm the bravest, strongest, most courageous person on the planet. When I have to have the really hard conversation or I have a really hard customer, or I have to deliver bad news, or I have to fire somebody. Like, those are things that people don't look forward to. And so, what am I like in that situation? How do I want to be? And then I practice being that person in my visualization, right? And now I'm preparing myself to handle that pressure. That works really well with guys getting ready to do like underwater military training, like dive training. Like, people, like, I know that my static breath hold is 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, whatever it is. And I know that they're going to ask me to go underwater, perform a relatively simple task that will take me less than 45 seconds to do. So why is it that as soon as I get down to the bottom of the pool in training, that I panic and go up? Well, I don't know why it is that you panic. That could be one of 1,000 things. But from a visualization standpoint, we don't need to practice going underwater. We don't need to practice doing the skill. We need to practice the sensation of the panic and become and accept that and understand, like, see ourselves, be like, yep, there it is. I know that I have time. I know how to do the skill. I'm just going to be calm under the water for a second. If I can see myself doing that over and over and over again, which average person in special operations is relatively high IQ, and that means that they think at approximately, I mean, this is a random, not a random number, but a pretty wide number, somewhere between like 800 to 1,500 words a minute. So we can do a lot of reps in a hurry. We think an image is even faster than that. So we're getting pretty effective reps. What happens over the course of even a week of that kind of training is panic, come back to the surface, panic, come back to the surface. Hey man, like, let's think about it like this. Do this visualization practice, work it out like this. The next day they'll come in, they'll still come to the surface, but they'll be like, I had a decision. I had a decision point where I felt the panic and I had to decide whether or not I'm going to the surface or I'm going to do the thing that I'm trying to convince myself to do. And that's step number one, right? And then the next time they go underwater, they still have the panic. They still come to the surface, but they're under there longer. And then the next time they try to do the skill. And then the next time they try to do the skill. And then the next time they get the skill done, and it's like, it works now. All it took us one time. But the hinge right there, the change is that they actually had the courage to do the thing that they've been practicing. And so you're essentially just convincing yourself how to do it. You could call it brainwashing if you want to, because that's how brainwashing works. But we could call communication manipulation in the same vein, right? Mm-hmm. I'm teaching it. Teaching can certainly be considered manipulation, because as a good teacher, I'm manipulating the way that you think about the subject matter so that you can understand it completely, right? And so from a visualization standpoint, when you see yourself fail, when you see that catastrophic malfunction in the middle of your competition stage, then that's not something like that you have to avoid or block, right? That's material for you to work through, because those kind of things are going to happen. You're going to experience pressure. You're going to experience stress. You're going to respond to it differently. Sometimes you're going to get lucky. Sometimes you're going to be good. Sometimes you're going to fall flat on your face. Those things are going to happen. It doesn't make sense to just pretend that they don't, right? That blind optimism doesn't work for anybody. So what we're looking for is, hey, I'm going through this, and my brain conjures up an image of me getting choked out because I made a mistake. All right. Well, what's the probability that you're going to get the gold medal? Well, there's how many people are in your weight class or your division? Only one of them leaves with the gold medal. So most of them are not going to leave with the gold medal, right? How am I going to carry myself if I get beat by somebody better than me? How am I going to carry myself if I lose because I didn't do what I was capable of doing and I'm disappointed in myself? How am I going to carry myself if I win? Right? Like, I need to be prepared for all of those things if I'm really going to be a master of the subject matter that I'm into. Because everything that turns everything into a learning opportunity. And in our visualization practice, that's the same approach. It's like, when I'm talking about control, if I'm looking at skill development, like first day that I'm trying to get somebody to visualize, hey, you're going to see yourself fail. Don't worry about it, but don't repeat it, right? Just stop it, instant replay. How do you want it to happen? Handle it that way. See yourself handling it that way. And then if they're into it, then we get into, what does it taste like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? And now we're starting to replicate those things. All right, now what happens if you have a malfunction? Are you going to panic and just rush through the rest of it? Or are you just going to fix the malfunction and get back to work? Because if we're not prepared for that, the most likely option is they're going to panic and rush through the rest of it because they feel like they're behind something, right? Instead of just clearing their malfunction and getting back to work, they're going to panic, and they're not going to execute the skill set to their capability. But if they're prepared for that and they've seen themselves in a pressure situation, bang, 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 click. Oh, what's wrong? Oh, double feed. What do I got to do? Magazine out, charging handle, charging handle, charging handle, finger, 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 get it out, back up. We're good. Where are we back? Where are we at? Boom, 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 boom. We're back to it. They're training themselves to do it they're training themselves to handle the unexpected misfortunes of the world. One of the sources of that is if I ask you to visualize giving your speech, like our hypothetical situation at SHOT Show where you're giving the speech, what are all the things that your brain's going to conjure up that could be bad for you? There's an unlimited number of things that you could imagine, right?
Sure.
All right, cool. How am I going to handle that? How am I going to handle that? How am I going to handle that? That turns into how am I going to prevent that? How am I going to prevent that? How am I going to prevent that? That turns into what do I need to do to be successful? Then I see myself do those things to be successful, right? But by blocking it and trying to avoid it, and we're setting ourselves up for some pretty catastrophic failures because the repetition goes really fast internally, right? Because we think so fast, we can get a lot of really bad reps in a hurry. And again, brain doesn't care if it's quote unquote good or quote unquote bad. It's just going to get really good at doing the things it does the most, right? Which is why the control is the number one fundamental. And then also why your practice, in the example that you shared with the jiu-jitsu tournament, was really effective because you went into all the details. You were completely prepared to handle that situation to the best of your capability.
It was a fun exercise. I played with it in other areas of life, but that was about the most thorough over the course of months. And of course, you can still, like you said, somebody better can still choke you. So I always, whenever I shared that story from a learning perspective, not a pat myself on the back lesson, I just got lucky too that I happened to have more skill than the guy next to me, because I could have had some dude that was a freaking state champion wrestler in high school that was the same belt as I and had a bunch of additional training that I didn't know about. I just got lucky and didn't have that guy. And I got in front of their OODA. I out OODA'd them.
That's right. Because you understood the context. Your domain expertise is good enough. Right? Sometimes good enough is just good enough,
That's an interesting concept in itself too. Like what's the desired end state, and did I get there? Do I need to now spend days or hours or weeks dissecting how I got there? Like, is the result, is that net benefit? Can I just leave it there and move on to something else? Because sometimes I feel like we get so into like maybe post analysis, which is something completely different, but like the what if stuff, like just accept it and move the fuck on. Like you're now not progressing elsewhere because you're living in this other time and place. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's just a matter of your priorities, I guess, because there is definitely the threat of paralysis by analysis by going down, and like chasing perfection is usually an obsession. And like most of if we're talking about sport world, like your Michael Jordans and Kobe Bryants and Tiger Woods, like they were the best in their field for the longest period of time. They were also obsessive about it. And we could also argue that as a result of that obsession, they had all the problems that were associated with their stories, right? Like they usually had a gambling problem, or they have some sort of adultery problem, or their personal life had a lot of issues, or whatever. And so it depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to be the best jiu-jitsu player on the planet, then other parts of your life are going to be sacrificed for that. Right? And so if your job is or if your goal is I own a firearm because I think it's a responsible thing for an American citizen to do. And I need to know how to be proficient with it because that's part of that responsibility. Then at some point, do I need to be able to run that firearm at the same level as a Delta Force operator? Probably not. Right. But do I need to be able to judiciously decide when to use it and be able to be competent enough to use it that I don't inflict harm on something that I'm not intending to inflict harm on? Yeah, probably. Right. Are those scenarios as like cut and dry, like cookie cutter, as we like to think they are? No, they're all their own unique experiences. And so it makes it a little bit harder. But if we're doing jujitsu, like one of the reasons, like why do you do jujitsu? Some people do it because it's good exercise. Some people do it because they enjoy the activity in and of itself, right? And so if I need to do jujitsu because I'm just personally satisfying to me, then I don't care if I win a gold medal or not because I just had fun doing jujitsu. If I do jujitsu because it's something that I do with my friends and I get my social interaction out of it, then I don't care if I win the gold medal. But if I only do jujitsu to win gold medals, then those three practices are going to be different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if we get into the paralysis by analysis thing, like, yeah, maybe you did get lucky because you didn't encounter somebody better than you. But that's not really how the sport world works. Like you came to, by entering the tournament, you volunteered yourself to face anybody else that decided to enter the tournament. Like you don't get to control that part of it. So at that level, like your job is to control what you can control and influence what you can't. And if your skill set ends up being the best skill set based on the seeding of the tournament, then you win the gold medal. If it doesn't, then maybe you win the silver or the bronze, or maybe you don't even make it to the qualifying rounds, whatever the case is. But at the end of the day, based on your goals, that should feed the way that you do your post activity analysis, right? Your AAR. Did the goals that I have for this entering this tournament, were they satisfied? And if winning the gold medal is the only goal, then chances are good that more often than not satisfied. Okay, why not? And now we have a different analysis afterwards. But did I go there with my buddies because we do this for fun and this is like our social interaction that we do outside, like in our personal life? Then yeah. Did I win? No. Would I have liked to win? Yeah. But man, that was fun, right? It's like when I go to shoot a USPSA comp, like, do I want to do well? Yeah. But that's not why I go. I don't go to win. I go because I enjoy shooting, but mostly I go because I enjoy being around people that like to do that kind of stuff.
But you want to win.
Sure, I do. I want to win, but I don't have any expectations that I'm going to go beat a grandmaster because I don't practice enough to be a grandmaster.
Sure.
Right? Like I can't expect to go beat a grandmaster if I don't shoot every single day.
Yeah, yeah.
That's just irrational. It's irrational through and through. That doesn't mean that people don't fall into that trap. That doesn't mean that I haven't fallen into that trap. But if I go shoot a USPSA with a couple guys from the unit that I work with, and they're like, "Hey, man, how'd it go?" I'm like, "Well, it went about as well as I was prepared to shoot," because that's the truth. If I won, then there probably weren't that many good shooters there. But if there's a couple special operations guys there, then I'm probably not going to win because they shoot every day or they shoot more frequently than I do. I didn't go necessarily to win. I went to go to do well, but I went to go do something that wasn't work. I went to do something that was recreation, that was fun. That's my primary motivation for doing it. If I wanted to go win the thing, then I better get my ass out and start practicing. Right? I can't go into it with an unrealistic expectation that I should win or I'm a complete failure if I haven't shot a pistol in the last 2 months. Those two things aren't congruent.
Right.
And so I have to have that realistic expectation of what my goals are because that feeds the post activity analysis. And if it's like, all right, it's time to get better at this to win, then that has to change my daily routine. But if I'm doing shooting competitions or jujitsu for other reasons, and those reasons are met, then if I win or lose just isn't that important. Like, I still want to do, like, personally, I want to do as well as I'm capable of doing, but I know that my capabilities dependent on my practice. And if I haven't been practicing, that changes my expectations for how well this should go. And it's not an excuse. It's just, that's how the world works.
Yeah.
Right. All, by definition, all skills are perishable, regardless of your belief system about shooting or jujitsu or boxing or underwater basket weaving. Like, if you don't practice it, it perishes. Right. It's like the old saying about, oh, you never forget how to ride a bike. Like, once you've figured out how to ride a bike, you can always ride a bike. But if you haven't ridden a bike in 2 years, you can still get on the bike, pedal, and not fall down. You're technically riding a bike, but you're not doing it as well as you did when you were 6. Right? The quality of it is still diminished because you haven't practiced.
Right.
So that paralysis by analysis can get people into trouble because we live in a social world as well as an emotional world. And if you're in a highly competitive environment and you're participating with people who are highly competitive and practiced, and you feel like a failure because you lost, well, you're wrong, because you performed up to the capability that you prepared yourself to do. And then that gets back into the character part of it, right? Is that if we can manage that part of our lives and say, like, what's a reasonable expectation for this outcome? What are our primary goals for doing these things? Then we know that, like, oh man, I'm really upset that I didn't win. Okay, cool. Like, I'm not here to tell you how you feel, but I will tell you that you shouldn't be upset because you didn't win, because you haven't practiced it. It goes back to some of the oldest research on achievement goal theory, where if you have a third grader who comes home from school and is like, hey dad, I got an A on my math test, and you're like, oh, that you must be smart. And he comes back the next quarter, hey dad, I got an A on my math test. Oh, you must be smart. Hey dad, I got an A on my math test. You must be smart. But what happens to that kid when he hits 5th grade and he has to do real math? And he comes home with a C on his math test. What is his only option to think about himself? Not smart anymore.
Smart anymore. Yeah.
I'm not smart enough anymore. Not smart enough anymore. But if you would have taken that same third grader and said, when he said, hey dad, I got an A on my math test, and you said, oh, you must have paid attention in class and taken good notes and asked good questions. So when he encounters 5th grade math and he gets a C, then what is his only option to believe? I must not be paying enough attention in class. I must not be taking enough notes. I must not be asking the right questions. Now I'm just going to go figure this out. It's not something that I can't do anymore. And so now we've altered that belief system about who I am in the world, which is essentially our character.
Good stuff. I think that's a good full circle spot to end her after 2 hours, sir.
All right.
That was there's a lot of ground to cover. I know that you, most of what you do is not public. You do have a public Instagram account. Do you have any other public material that you put out?
No, not specifically. I do a little bit of side hustle work, but nothing that I'm aggressively after, just because it's just doesn't meet my goals right now. Right? Trying to prep the environment for the future a little bit in terms of being able to share some of the things that I've learned with people who are interested in learning it, whether that's in the corporate world or the athletic world or the quote unquote tactical world. But for the most part, I'm still down and in focused on the people that I'm choosing to serve right now. And those people are still really important to me. So I'm not actively pursuing anything, but I'm also not kind of like, turning things down that fit into the schedule and the goal structure for right now. But yeah, I dabble around on Instagram. I don't take it very seriously. I don't really have a mission with it. I think it's mostly entertainment. And I have a good time, keeping up with some people that I don't get to talk to every day on there. But No, from a social media standpoint or like a marketing standpoint, some of those things are starting to get put into motion, but none of them are deliberately chasing anything specific.
So that being said, if you guys want to find this guy, you can't. He's a freaking ghost. But you got to hear this discussion, and maybe depending on where you viewed or listened to this, if it's on one of the podcast platforms or if it's on YouTube, wherever you're at, throw something in the comments. From time to time, I go peruse those comments and I'll forward it over, or go visit Doc Huhn on Instagram. Let's see, it's DOCHUN.
I think it's
Is there an underscore in there?
I think so. Let me look at it.
Hey, maybe you can shoot him a question, and maybe he'll respond. Maybe he won't. That's about
no. I'm usually pretty good at it. It says that it's DOCHUHN.
So no underscore, nothing like that.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't even know how to look it up.
Open up your Instagram account.
Let me see if I can figure this out for you real fast.
I'll post it in the show notes. You guys,
it tells me the username, but is the @ the same?
Should be.
Go ahead. Keep talking. I'll figure it out.
That's it. You guys that tuned in, I appreciate you digging into the conversation. Lots of stuff to unpack here. This is the kind of stuff that we try to talk about in this space. Shooting guns is easy. Pounding nails is easy. Cutting on people with knives is easy, but it's doing stuff over and over again consistently, getting good results. That's the part that we're all striving to do. Be well. Don't be dickheads. Tell somebody you love them. And if you dug this podcast, go share it on your social media so more people can hear it. Thank you, Seth. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the work that you guys are doing for the community. I know that Z speaks highly of you, not just as an instructor, but as a human being in the world, and that's important to me. So I'm happy to be here and honored that you want to talk to me.
Of course, man. Z's talked about you for years, man. You gotta call up old Doc Huhn, man. Get that guy on the bro.
Yeah, well, I love me some Z, but Z's planning is usually like 24 hours ahead of time, and so my world works a little bit differently than that most of the time. So I'm like, yeah, Z, I'd love to help you out, but I can't do it tomorrow.
Ooh, I can't wait till he hears this because he breaks my balls because he says he's the planner. Hey, Z, did you hear that?
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, we'll see.
Visit our website, CarryTrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., CarryTrainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@CarryTrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@CarryTrainer.com or CarryTrainer.com.